Hi, and welcome to my channel. Title of this episode is Your Perfect Palette, Earth Oranges. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the importance of including earth orange in your palette. Earth orange is a versatile and essential addition to any artist's toolkit. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, earth orange can add depth and warmth to your paintings. So grab your brushes and let's dive into the world of earth orange. So I think the first thing to mention here is, what exactly do I mean by earth orange? Some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, earth orange, I don't know if I have that pigment. To be clear, earth orange for me is a term. It refers to a space in my palette. It's a well that I call earth orange, whatever is in there. And it generally adheres to a few distinct properties with respect to all the other paints that are in my palette. So if we're looking at this graphic here, you can see where we've got, our primaries, some of the ones that I have talked about in other videos. I've talked about yellows, I've talked about reds, I've talked about blues, and more recently I have spoken about earth yellow. And today we're talking about earth orange. So if we look around here, our primaries are all going to be our brighter colors, as well as some of the secondaries. And then as we start to go inside of the color wheel and get closer towards the center of a traditional artist's color wheel, our colors get duller, right? And that's where I find, or where we will find, what I term as the earth colors. I'm sure I'm not the only one that uses this term, but nevertheless. So here, where orange is on our palette, we kind of go in, and as it gets duller, we have this area here that is earth orange. So it's not a specific pigment, it's just a label for a variety of oranges that can actually occupy that space. So let's switch over and take a look at a fairly handy little reference here. This is the Color Map by Daniel Smith. And it is a very, very handy resource with lots, all their pigments that they make are all on here. And it follows a fairly logical pattern. Looks a lot like a traditional color wheel, going around from middle yellow towards the greens, greens transitioning towards blues, into violets, reds, around to warm reds, oranges, all the way back around the wheel, all the way to yellow again. We're not worried about all that. Just another quick description of this. Very pretty to look at. And the way that these things are set up, colors that are closer towards the center have a lower chroma. So they're brighter as they are towards the outside. So as you kind of go around, further they are away from the center, the hues are going to be a brighter, higher chroma paint. And as we come around, we can get towards some oranges and warm reds over here. And what I want to be talking about, as per the graphic that I had shown previously, we're going to be looking inside. So we don't want any of the colors around the outside. I want dull oranges. One of the first ones that kind of pops up for me, and one I have used before, is a pigment by Daniel Smith called Quinacridone Sienna. Now I am using a Daniel Smith color map, generated color map here, and they of course are referencing their pigments. But the important thing to really pay attention to as we go through this is what the component pigments are. Because, while I do use a number of paints by Daniel Smith, they're not the only brand that I use. Ultimately, I'm looking for a quality of paint, a hue where it sits in the overall color wheel, and then certain qualities of a paint, whether it's, transparent, semi-transparent, granulating, non-granulating. Those types of things are more what I'm concerned about. So, and as a result, I'll use a paint by almost anyone if it fits the right attributes for me. So the main thing to concern yourself with is what the actual pigment, what the ingredients are. Now, it does change a little bit depending on, especially some of the pigments that we're talking about today, because they will have a pigment name, but they can have a number of different results from the same pigment name. It can get a little bit confusing, but ultimately you want to, think about what you want to look for, where it sits on the color wheel, and then use your paint, swatch it out, and trust your eyes. It's always the best way to go, in my opinion. So quinacridone sienna is a slightly duller orange compared to some other options. Suppose that we'll kind of come in a little bit further. And we have another orange pigment that you can see the difference between the one I had previously looked at and now this one, where it looks a lot duller as it comes in from the outside, also an orange. And this is a fairly popular option as far as an earth orange goes, and one that I have used quite a lot. It's interesting, though. It sometimes can throw people. I find that when it is, fresh out of a well and you make a puddle with it, it looks really bright. And unless you've spent a lot of time with your pigments, you might wash that out and go, oh, this is too bright. And you might, add some complement to it to try to dull it down, or, a dark neutral to try to dull it down. And then you get a result as it dries and the color shifts, because the color will shift quite a bit with the quinacridone burnt orange, in that when it's wet and freshly applied, it can look quite bright. But as it dries, it does dull down considerably. So always something to be aware of with your paints. And, that sort of awareness does come with use, though it can be a little bit jarring at first, because you look in your palette, you think you see what you're going to get, and then you're like, okay, well, they do lighten a bit, so maybe you add a bit more pigment, and it gets a bit stronger, and then it does, lighten a little bit, but then it also dulls down quite a bit. So it's tough with this one, though it is beautiful. And as we come in a little bit further, we get to some other roasted French ochre. This is, typical for a lot of the paints by Daniel Smith. There's, they'll shift some of the pigments. So this is Pigment Red 102, which is not going to be one of the ones that I'm going to be speaking to specifically today. They have all these slight variations. They have so many different paints that you can really cater things to your preferences. So Earth Orange, I'm not going to be able to get through this without talking about Burnt Sienna. I'm not too sure about the color swatch here. This doesn't really look like Burnt Sienna to me. It looks more like a Van Dyke Brown or something like that. But, Burnt Sienna is a very traditional earth orange. It's been around for a very long time. The component pigment of it is PBR7, which is a pigment brown 7, the natural iron oxide. And as I mentioned earlier, there are certain pigments that can come in a variety of flavors, and this is certainly one of them. It depends on, certain things like quantity of trace manganese, aluminum, or silica, size of the pigment particles, and many other things can contribute to the actual hue of PBR7. So for burnt sienna, they're using a version of PBR7 that is more to the orange. Okay? It is a very, very traditional pigment. It is a little granulating, and it can be, I wouldn't say opaque, but it's definitely not as transparent as some watercolors. And that can vary depending on the brand that you're using as well. But as traditional it is and as common as it can be in many artists' palette, it's not one that I lean towards personally, because I tend to prefer mostly non-granulating pigments. I prefer to get my texture in other ways, as opposed to just texture from the paint. There are some pigments in my palette that do granulate a little bit, but those ones can't be helped. Things like ultramarine, which has a bit of granulation to it, and so on and so forth. But burnt sienna, there are other options that can get me what I want as far as an earth orange pigment goes. So I just need to talk about burnt sienna because it is definitely a player in the game. Go up here, there's a Pompeii red, which is quite lovely. Again, we see the PBR7. So it's just a slightly different flavor, but it is the same pigment as the burnt sienna. So you'll see some similar attributes here in that it is also granulating and it's also semi-transparent, just like burnt sienna. And then we'll move in a little bit further here and we'll come to the burnt sienna light. This is, I wouldn't say it's brand new, but it's relatively new by Daniel Smith. And it is a mixture of a couple of pigments. It uses the pigment orange 48, which is a quinacridone orange, which is actually, the pigment that is the component pigment of quinacridone burnt orange. And then it also uses the pigment red 101, which is a synthetic red iron oxide. The combination of these produces a paint that is very similar in hue to the to burnt sienna, but it is non-granulating and it is a lot more transparent than burnt sienna. This tends to be what I go for in an earth orange. So I'm going to just close this down. I had selected some. If we go further in, we start getting into browns. Because really brown is a duller version of orange. And then depending on the brown, it can be duller versions of red too, because just like you open up a chocolate bar, you get a nice dark bittersweet chocolate. And that brown, a label of color that we would associate with chocolate, if you actually look at the color of your chocolate bar, and you are certainly welcome to go out and acquire a variety of different chocolates for investigative research purposes. But you will see that the brown varies from a slightly red color and some of the darker bittersweet chocolates to more of like kind of warmer browns and things like that. From like a milk chocolate and that kind of thing. So you can have orangier toned chocolate and you can have redder toned chocolate as well. So main area we're talking about in here is really just these oranges. I'm not going to go much further. Let's open this up and let's enlarge this. And here are some of the ones that I was just talking about. So the first one was the quinacridone sienna, and you can see it now side by side to the quinacridone burnt orange. It does appear much brighter. Now, I do have, warm reds and warm yellows, and I do keep an orange in my palette, and those are all quite bright compared to, what I would consider to be an earth orange. So this is too bright for me to include in a spot that I would term as earth orange. So while it is duller than many other options for as far as an orange goes, it's just not quite dull enough for my tastes. So that goes down to quinacridone burnt orange. Now this is one that I have used in my palette, and it is a pretty standard option for people that don't prefer burnt sienna, and that is definitely what I would switch back and forth with for a number of years. Was I would try burnt orange and then I would try burnt sienna, and I would go back and forth between the two, always eventually preferring the more transparent nature of the quinacridone burnt orange. Now, preferring, it's an important term when we're talking about your perfect palette, right? The transparent aspect is my preference. So it's a choice that I would lean towards in putting together my palette. The hues, while slightly different, they're in the same ballpark. and hue-wise in your palette, it's not going to make that much of a difference, because quite often these paints, or at least paints in my palette, they're not being used on their own, right? So rarely will you see a passage in a painting that I've made where it's like, oh, that is only, for example, quinacridone burnt orange. It's going to be quinacridone burnt orange with a little bit of something else, right? So there's always going to be slight little shifts and variations in the paint. That's why I say it's a hue, it's a spot on the color wheel that I have a pigment for, and if it's quinacridone burnt orange or burnt sienna, it's really not that big a deal. It's more the actual quality of the paint that I'm concerned about, and that quality relates to things like whether it's granulating or non-granulating, transparent or semi-transparent, and then also perhaps maybe the staining, or how non-staining or very staining it might be. That could be a concern as well. And when you use this color map, you can see all these attributes listed out. It's very, very handy. Certain paints like reds and things like that, there aren't many options that have low staining, but with these earth oranges, we can see that for something like burnt sienna, it's non-staining, similar to like a cobalt blue, colors that are very easy to rework the edges. As they get more staining, they tend to, for lack of a better term, burn in or imprint into the paper, and that can create some hard edges if you let the paint sit there too long and don't get in and soften your edges, if soft edges are what you're looking for. And then we're going to bump over one more, and we're going to look at burnt sienna light. Now this is a moderately new pigment within the last 4 or 5, maybe 6 years, by Daniel Smith, and this is what I have been using more so lately. It is a little duller than quinacridone burnt orange, but the hue of it is very similar to burnt sienna, and I find it neutralizes a little better with ultramarine, as far as establishing grays. If I want to use a warm and a cool to make a gray, burnt sienna light and the ultramarine go together quite nicely, in my experience. But it is non-granulating compared to a little bit of granulation in the quinacridone burnt orange, and it is also transparent, similar to the quinacridone burnt orange. So I've got my earth orange hue as far as in the overall circular pattern of the color wheel, in that orange area, and then the nature of it is duller. So this is a really good spot. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about Pompeii Red. Here again, we see PBR7, same as with the burnt sienna. And you can see, well, this swatch is not accurate. I would be very curious to know what they actually used here. But I have burnt sienna by Daniel Smith, and when I swatch it out, it does not look like this. So Pompeii Red is another nice option. It's a little odd because, while referred to as red, it definitely has a bit more of an orange lean to my eyes. But it is also quite granulating, so that does pose an issue for me, and is also semi-transparent. So I'm showing it more as an option. You can see as these all kind of line up together, see where it all sort of sits in that orange section of a color wheel, and you can see how they're all not really bright. They're all have a little bit of dullness to them, with an argument being made for quinacridone sienna, which is distinctly brighter than the other 4 that are on this page. So I really hope this helps out with some thoughts on earth orange. We're looking at it where it sits on the color wheel. We're trying to stay in the orange area of the color wheel. And then I'm trying not to use a pigment that's too bright. I want something that's more naturally dull. And many of these fit that bill. And then I'm thinking about, the granulating aspects and the transparency aspects of these paints as well. I'm looking for things that, for my tastes, I prefer things that are more transparent. And I also prefer things that are not granulating. So if the option is there for me to work with a paint that is non-granulating, then I will pursue that option. So burnt sienna light tends to fit or check most of the boxes for me. So if you have any questions about anything that I've spoken about today, feel free to do so in the comments. If you have found this video helpful in any way, do like and subscribe. I'm going to be continuing on through the colors that I have yet to speak about. I think Earth Reds, talking about dark neutrals, and be talking about greens. And I think probably do another one on secondaries. So I'm going to do greens, which is a secondary, but I think that one's going to be a little bit longer than, either orange or violet. So I'll probably talk about orange and violet together, and then I'll do a breakout one specifically on greens, because there is kind of a lot to talk about with greens, with the single pigment greens and with convenience mixture greens as well. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll talk to you again another time. Until then, happy painting.